All right, welcome everyone. Now we are starting. Thank you for being here with us today on our panel about the impact of funding for open source. And we have a very different composition from when we originally submitted the panel. But these are fantastic people. And so I'm super excited for, yeah?
What do they call it in the theater when you're like for the understudies? Is that what you say? Still going to be great.
So just to set the stage a little bit, when we look back at the history of open source and the role funding has played, open source coming out of the free software movement was driven a lot by volunteers who wanted to build software free from constraints, share it freely, build things for themselves, and then enjoy that with others. Over the years, especially the last 15 years, there have been a lot of companies that have realized the benefits of working in an open source way with a license that is giving us a lot of freedoms. So now we find projects where a lot of the contributors are actually paid by companies. And different studies show different percentages of paid versus unpaid contributors. We've had many conversations over the last 10 years on the problem of funding because there are still a lot of projects that are maintained by contributors who are not paid for their work, but they're creating very critical pieces of software that run a lot of the internet or servers that are in a lot of different places. So we've been talking for a long time about how do we make sure that this very important work is funded so that they can focus on this very important work and get the support that they need. Also, how do we sustain this over the long term? Where does the funding come from? So we have funding that comes from individuals. We have funding that comes from nonprofit organizations. We have funding that comes from companies that are giving to open source. We even have governments that are giving funding to open source. So the landscape has changed a lot to where we are today. The problems of how to give to open source projects has also been improving from, in the beginning, how do you give to an open source project? If it's just a set of volunteers, do they take the money to their personal bank account? There's no accountability. Setting up fiscal hosts, having foundations, there's a lot of infrastructure that has been built throughout open source for the last years. So we want to talk about all of this and have a focus on how do we look at the impact of funding? What does it do to open source projects, to the contributors, so that we can, for the future, direct funding in a better way. That's the setup for today. And now I would like to introduce our panelists to introduce themselves because they have a lot of background and perspectives that I'm super excited to talk with you about. Shall we start with you, Alyssa?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Alyssa Wright. I'm part of the Open Source Program Office at Bloomberg. And we think a lot of, go Bloomberg. So we are an open source first company. And we think a lot about like the sustainability of open source, the health of the open source projects, because so much of our products and services rely on open source. And so we have instituted a number of different, we call it FOSS funding programs, often in partnership with philanthropy. So I'm excited to talk about that here today.
So I'm Dawn Foster. I've been working in open source for, a very long time. Mostly within companies and open source program offices. But most recently, I'm the director of data science for the Chaos project. So the Chaos project, if you're not familiar with it, is a Linux Foundation project focused on community health analytics for open source software. So not public health, but open source project health. And in addition to that, I'm also on the board of Open UK, and I do a little bit of consulting with the Sovereign Tech Fund in Germany as one of their external experts who help them select projects. So through part of that work, I spent some time with some of the folks at the Sovereign Tech Fund who are trying to better measure the impact of the funding that they're doing through the German government. And so this kicked off a few things that we'll talk about later, but it kicked off a paper that I did jointly with Paul Sherratt and Kaylin Osborne and Mirko Baum. So we have a paper about measuring the impact of funding. And we started a working group within the CHAOS project around measuring the impact of funding. So that's how I come to this panel.
Hello, everyone. Whoa. I'm Andrew Nesbitt, flown over from the UK to be here and talk about my experiences. I'm an open source developer, maintainer, and package manager nerd. I'm very interested in the ways that the dependency graph of open source has spread across the whole world and connected developers and companies and organizations together, and then how that dependency graph can be used to create the most impact and the most improvement in all of open source, or in the most critical places in that dependency graph that can have the biggest knock-on effect, because everyone now depends on open source, and so improvements there can have knock-on improvements across large groups of people and potentially the whole world. I work on a project called Ecosyste.ms, which has got an unpronounceable domain name, I found, now that I'm starting to talk about it in words rather than just type it, which is Ecosyste.ms. There's one way you can try and pronounce that. And that is an index of as much different kinds of open source metadata as possible. So packages on package managers, repositories on different repository hosts across all different kinds of platforms. So not just GitHub, but every different GitLab instance that is publicly accessible, Git, Forjo, Bitbucket, kind of every different place that there might be open source code that is hosted. And then also looking at data around kind of even more auxiliary data to that. So things like the data inside of Open Collective, GitHub sponsors, and even just a couple of weeks ago, indexing all of Dependabot's activity to try and find like where activity is happening in open source, and to be able to give back that data in different ways that can be useful to enable insights that would otherwise be really hard to collect or require a lot of rework and a lot of kind of data downloading, which can often put a lot of load and stress on individual services, especially package managers. All of that work is really trying to make that data normalized and usable across every different software ecosystem. One of the challenges I found with kind of people working in this space is often they'll implement a tool that will work for one package manager registry or just GitHub, and they'll use that, but then they won't make that work for others because it's kind of diminishing returns to keep implementing every different package manager, or to go and implement every different Git host, right? All of that work then, I've normalized that out and made that available for research, and hopefully I can bring some of those insights today. Sorry, I'm rambling.
Yeah, I know you have a lot of data, and we'll share some of that today. I have a request for you all listening. We want to make this interactive, so think of anything you want to dig in deeper. We're happy to take some questions. I'll ask one question to the panelists, and then we open it up for any questions you have. I have backup questions, so no pressure at all. Also, we are open to talk with you afterwards if we don't get to your question. I don't think I introduced myself. I'm Georg Link. Hi, everyone. So the question is...
Who are you, Georg? You have a butterfly garden.
Okay, fine. A little bit more. I'm one of the founders of the CHAOS project, the Community Health Analytics for Open Source Software project. I am the open source strategist and director of sales at Bitergia. I've been in open source for many moons, and right now I'm working on a research project on the funding in open source, so that's kind of why I'm here. They're the experts. I'm just trying to learn. So the question that we wanted to start with is, what have you learned over your time funding open source, looking at the funding, being involved in the funding cycles, looking at the impact that has shifted your perspective over the years?
I'm happy to take this on first, because I think this is an interesting question because so much has changed. Like once you're kind of practicing in the space, you think you always know there's things you don't know, and then you're, I think, constantly humbled by how much you don't know, or at least for me. And so I sit on the board of Open Source Collective. I've been in part of this like FOSS funding space for about probably 8 years now, and for me, one of the most like fundamental things is that it's way more than just giving grants or giving money. Like, I mean, this is a really important part to the conversation, but it's really important I think for all of us to, when we think about FOSS sustainability, that we're really thinking of a larger question of health and engagement. And so I often think about the work that we do at Bloomberg in a space we call it the AND framework, that like the business value of giving back to open source needs to be like more than beyond like transactional value of like giving a grant, getting something back, and more about long-term investment and really building things for like long-term impact for both yourself and for the larger community.
Yeah, and I would say that one of the things that I've learned is really just how incredibly difficult it is to measure the impact of this funding. So especially when you're talking about governments doing the funding. So in the case of the Sovereign Tech Fund, you've got the German government. How do you show them the impact of the public money that they're giving to you? And the same thing, NGI, Next Generation Internet, is another funding program out of the EU, for example. And so looking at these, and they're very different models, right? So you look at Sovereign Tech Fund, which funds critical digital infrastructure, so maintenance of the things that we all use and depend on. NGI, on the other hand, is funding innovation. So they're looking at new features, things like that. And every open source project is different. So you've got these very, very different purposes for funding these projects. You have these very, very different projects. And in the case of, I see the Sovereign Tech Fund applications, but there's a whole list of objectives that they're planning, how they're planning to use the funding. And so, measuring the impact of that really is about measuring a project against the objectives for what they said that they were going to do with the funding, and that's a very, very much an individual thing. And it's not just as easy as going out and gathering a bunch of data. You actually also have to go out and talk to some of these people about what worked, what didn't, and gather that qualitative data as well, because it's the numbers just don't tell you the whole story. And so it gets really complex very quickly.
One thing I'd say I didn't realize the scale of until I really started to delve into the data was how many projects are just individuals that are like the owner of the project, the sole maintainer of the project. I pulled some numbers a couple of days ago. If you look at the 10,000 kind of top most critical projects, we call it, it's not 1%, it's smaller than that, but let's call it the 1% for simplicity. 55% of those projects are owned by a user account on GitHub. Like that means that no one else can be an admin for that account. Like, and just that one aspect is like the criticality of that project is entirely on that person's shoulders. And then they're also expected to be like, the world depends on you. You need to be able to step up and kind of act like a whole organization just for your single project. Is a massive ask. So it's not just like there are small kind of hobbyists in the kind of perimeter of these very large projects, but actually there's a good chunk of critical projects which are just run by a single person and often just in total isolation and not really aware of a lot of these efforts. They're not coming to conferences like this to learn about these things, and they don't even necessarily know that there are options available to them because they're just, sat in Nebraska hacking away on something that's critical to the whole software ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you. So we have that there's more to it than money, and that it's really difficult to measure the impact. We need to do quantitative and qualitative, and that we have some structural challenges with just how there can be more people involved. Now I want to open it up to you. Who would have some questions? I see 2 hands. We'll start over here with Katarina.
Thank you, Georg. To your point, Paul, we've come across, I'm with G Research Open Source. Andrew. I think I know. Oh, Andrew, sorry. Thank you. We've come across a few of those singular, maintainers, and we have done our best to financially support, sponsor through GitHub, et cetera. And what we're hitting up against now is they say, yes, we'd love to have a few more maintainers. And we're like, great, we'll do that. We can help, And then they don't press the buttons to give us that maintainer access. And so I'm now at the point of how can we brainstorm some additional maybe resources? Maybe they are blocked by, they have their values that they want in the project. Like there's still something holding them back. And I don't think it's just time. I think there's something else. So I want to put that out to you all. What do you think are some of the last little bits that will allow those single maintainers to like hand over some of this access and responsibility?
Thank you.
I think a lot of these people are, scared that something like the XZ incident will hit them. So the problem is, you giving people access is, it could be problematic. Like in the case of the XZ situation, where there was someone who had basically groomed this project so that they could become a maintainer, and then they did very malicious things with that maintainership. So I think we're still on the back end of that, and I think it's making people a lot more cautious.
If I can, I think fundamentally, and while you were sharing your story and what you were speaking about here, I feel like it's a problem about trust, like that we really need to be able to figure out ways to build trust in an authentic way, and then also trust each other to open up these spaces. You can imagine one person working in Nebraska alone on a project for a long time. It's hard, I think, on a human level to open it up for others. Like, do you really trust that person, and why would you? And so I think building cultural spaces where we can build trust with each other. I always thought it was interesting talking about trust. I'm going to make a little tangent, but I think it's relevant. In the blockchain space, or this is a trustless. You don't need trust in order to make kind of transactions across the network. And I always thought that was an interesting way of framing and what they call an open source ecosystem, because I think trust is a really important part of how we kind of operate in the world and how we grow and create a space for others. So I don't think there's a clear solution to exactly what you said, but I think thinking about the problem less about framing the problem of how do we build trust with this project, rather than how do we grow the community might be another way of figuring out solutions.
One thing, personally have been a solo maintainer that is quite scary and complicated and outside of a maintainer's kind of natural skill set, is around expanding the governance of a project, going from a single person who has complete and total control, the last kind of say and sign off on everything that's happening, as well as the responsibilities. But when you come to look at how do I implement governance in a project, and how do I then make sure that that is done well, because it kind of then gets enshrined into the shape of the community that gets built up. That stuff is like really complicated and hard if you don't have any experience with that. And there isn't that much documentation around it. If you go look at another open source project, especially a big one, you're like, whoa, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of kind of almost legalese around the way that the community is defined. Maybe if we had kind of blueprints and well-documented paths of how that can work, or even like, I saw a really good talk at FOSDEM about the idea that treating, like how you go about defining governance for a project is kind of like treating it like a code base, and the levels of APIs where different parties are interfacing into this thing helped me as a programmer better understand like the pieces that are involved in that and the different stages of governance. That is definitely a big kind of blocker mentally for people to be able to kind of take that on. It can be hard to get them to kind of take that on, because it's often stepping out of your comfort zone even more than just, oh, someone else has a commit bit, which is a kind of a more natural thing for a developer. I don't know, I guess the solution is a lot of kind of documentation and training around that as well.
I just wanted to get in the picture because we have the photographer here.
Should we be talking?
Yeah. So
Blah, 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 blah.
on that note, the governance, it changes how the project needs to be handled if you share the responsibility. And my personal philosophy has always been, I don't want to be a bottleneck. There has to be always someone else who can take over, and we don't have one person with the keys to the kingdom. So that's one way. We had one back here, those. Okay, I'm keeping track of who has hands up.
Thank you. I'm Stu Waldron, and I'm involved with two nonprofits, the Open Travel Alliance, and I am the Outreach Committee Chair for Open API. Looking for grants is hard. So I've done two with the Sovereign Tech Fund, one for the Open Travel Alliance and one for Open API. And that was a challenge because it takes a lot of bandwidth. It takes a lot to fill all that out. And unfortunately, when you don't make it, they don't give you any feedback about what you could have done better. So that's been one problem. On the other, I've looked for how to track down various forms of grants. And at least in the United States, I came across one source that is for nonprofits to help you find grants. But for those who know the tax implications here, that's for 501(c)(3)s. Most of work in the technical area are 501(c)(6). And nobody helps 501(c)(6)s. So I'm just curious, is other things you've come across that would help with grants and finding that type of funding?
Can I answer that question?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Michael. I run a project called Alpha Omega. We're RA 501(c)(3)(6). And we fund pretty much anything that has public good around it. So I think that there is a way there, but I think if your project depends upon grants of a sovereign tech fund nature, or other things like that, or even grants from Alpha Omega, you have not got sustainability built in. You are trying to get over a threshold, and I'm going to usurp my microphone time now because I don't want to dominate later on. Everything you were talking about in the first section about measuring impact, and then the second piece around sort of what people are trying to do, and the sort of governance piece and the contributions and building communities, it feels like there's something really interesting around thresholds of state on projects and measuring impact around their ability to transition from one state to the next. So a project, the 0, 1, or many is an old thing in computer science, right? And so a project that has one person working on it is a huge phase change away from having governance. Once they have governance and maintainers and multiple people, adding another one is not as big a catastrophic change. So when you think about measuring the success of the work, if it's build a thing that does a thing, then the existence of the feature is a threshold change of work. If you're looking at funding to improve the sustainability of the project, whether it is open API or ecosystems or other things like that, then their progression through various states of governance or sustainability become, again, measurable progress. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I 100% agree that just continuing to chase grants does not make a project sustainable, because the grant getting is incredibly labor intensive, and so what the grants give you is like you said, it's kind of a stepping stone. It's like a shot of adrenaline for the project. And that's hard. That you can't really sustain a project on the one-off grants.
Sustainable owner member fees. This was to expand the scope into
Yeah.
a certain capability that would benefit the industry. So we weren't looking for grants to sustain ourselves. It was everything you described to extend.
Yeah, and so it's one of the things that personally that I look at when I'm evaluating proposals is how the project is going to use those funds and how what they're using the funds for is going to make the project more sustainable. So that's one of the things that I look for is, how are they going to set themselves up for future success after the funding goes away? And then, and the other piece of this, so I'm also doing a project right now with Welcome with 2 L's, which is a very large funder. Primarily, it's been more in the medical space, but in the UK. And they've funded some open source projects around research software. And one of the things that they've asked a few of us to do is to put together kind of a curriculum for these projects to help them, so they've got some funding. What do they do with it? How do they set themselves up? How do they set up governance? How do they how do they do all of these things to make their project a little bit more sustainable so that when the funding is over, hopefully they've set themselves up to be a more sustainable project in the future. So obviously all of these problems are hard.
One thing there that a lot of projects find themselves in a place where they're like, oh, okay, as Michael said, there's different states. We've ended up in this very high level of state in terms of how much we're used and depended on, but we didn't move up in the steps of terms of kind of the project's maturity as a community and as an organization at the same rate, and we ended up kind of like, oops, we're critical now. Now what do we do? Kind of having that. You almost want someone to kind of chase around after projects and be like, don't forget, like you can't just like work on the quality of code. As soon as it becomes useful and adopted, then we need to be opening issues to be like, have we considered the non-code aspects of this project to how to kind of expand it would be a really good way to contribute to these projects is to, to give them a push, a kick to consider these non-technical aspects in how that project grows as well, which is often overlooked. But maybe there's like a dependabot of project like governance that's kind of like, we noticed that your project has become heavily used or is a dependency of a very successful other large project. Like, have you considered adding this, that, kind of taking these steps and using some of those guidelines and curriculums to form a pathway that's more obvious for how you could step up? It doesn't really help answer your question, but one thing I found is there are people out there that are very, very good at writing grants. If you can find one of them, grab onto them, don't let them go, because they have done it enough that they are experienced and can do it quite quickly and also know the kind of all of the bullet points that you need to hit to be able to be more successful with a grant. Doesn't mean it's going to be a guaranteed success, but those people can easily kind of have a massive return on investment in helping your project.
If I can add one other point, I feel like a lot of the feedback to the question was from the perspective of the project and the foundation. And I really think that coming from like the corporate perspective, that we need to get better at that. Like sustainability, it needs to be a priority for us, and to think about how to bridge like effectively with 501c6s, if that's like the barrier. And that I think is the responsibility of people who work, in companies to take like, again, the learnings here, what Frank Nagel talked about, the business value of open source, like this is the job of the OSPO is, I think, is one of the partners in helping to sustain these spaces. So I think I don't think it's a failure of, we can always get better in all of our spaces, but like, I don't think it's necessarily a failure of projects or foundations, that there is a crisis of sustainability. I think it's also a failure of the industry that like gains so much value from it.
You're sparking things off in my brain. I wonder if you're talking about businesses, often open source projects don't really know which big businesses are very dependent on their projects. Finding that out is hard sometimes, especially when that data is not particularly public. But often, like, if you can find that out and reach out to those businesses, then again, it's a different kind of grant approach, but there are definitely conversations to be had for aligning business interests and features with the kind of a grant feature or kind of extra work that you would like to do to connect that to a large kind of user of the project, if you can find the data to kind of give you that insight into which companies. And maybe that's also on OSPOs to be reaching out directly to projects to say, just so you know, like, we're using you, and we depend on you, and we would like these things to happen potentially.
I want to add one thought here. From what I'm seeing is there's funding for new ideas and new projects and new features, and there's funding for very popular and widely used projects. There's a gap in the middle. We have not that much time left, and I saw 3 hands, so I'm going to, now there's 4 hands. So I'm trying something where I'm going to ask the 4 people what their question is, then pass it on to the panel, and then do the closing, because we're coming on the end of our time. So if you can keep it short. Michael, did you already?
I think I said more than enough.
Thank you, Georg. Hi, I'm Courtney Robertson. I wear 2 hats. I work at GoDaddy, and I co-founded the WP Community Collective, which is a 501c6. GoDaddy put some seed money in to the tune of a little over $500,000 into this, which is amazing. Very thankful. We're working through funding contributor programs, and I would like some insights on economies of scale when you have a global audience of contributors, as well as insights around when you need I'm coming from the WordPress space, when you need to hit a critical mass in your contributions to be able to demonstrate the value of contribution. Because if you just fund one person, you might not get the thing that they're contributing to actually to go anywhere. You need to hit a critical mass to get there. So I'd love insights on both like global economies and how to identify where to get the critical mass you need for the value.
Thank you. Sally, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah,
okay.
You're keeping notes on these questions.
And then one more here.
I'm Maya. Gosh, I don't even know where to begin. Andrew, a lot of your work sounds very familiar to a system I built 6 years ago. I did it from the corporate perspective. I wanted to be able to identify projects within an organization that needed heavier levels of funding. We deployed it at Indeed to a fairly sizable scale. I felt like I went down the route of like doing the right thing, inner sourcing it, getting it out in open source, tech talks, panel discussions, yada, 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 never reached that critical mass. I wound up shelving it from burnout back in 2021 and haven't picked it up since because of just getting burned by a few sponsors at KubeCon, and just was curious about like what happens when things don't go right, or what happens when you feel like you have an idea and just don't get the traction that you're looking for. So.
Thank you. Okay, since we had 2 skip, one last one.
This is a fun one. All right, so we've been talking about how corporations and governments are the big funders of record that want a return on their investment. Let's take that out of the equation and let's say a bunch of money fell out of the sky with no strings attached to it. What would you do with that money to improve open source with no strings attached?
All right, so we collected 3 questions. You don't have to answer all of them. It's up to you what you want to answer to. Courtney was asking about global economy and how to build critical mass. Maya asked about what happens when things don't end up how you hope they would. And then Tim was asking about money with no strings attached. What would you do?
Okay, Courtney, the thing that jumped to my mind, and maybe this is the hacker in me rather than kind of from the funder's perspective, but I feel like being strategic about where you fund the work there could have a big impact, and thinking WordPress is a massive project and also has some really strange governance things going on, right? This is definitely, really? Yeah, you should look this up. There's some interesting stories go there. Trying to insert almost forcibly, right? Because there's a good amount of money there. Trying to insert that into a project can often be kind of bounce off. And to use a Star Wars metaphor, you really want to just try and get some strategic shots to go in through to start kind of exploding it from the inside to be able to kind of open that project back up again. And where my brain goes to is can you work on things that could almost stand alone and then kind of be used together in conjunction, rather than kind of saying we have to, the contributions have to be directly into the core project every time.
We've worded our nonprofit to not be limited in that manner, yes.
I have a slight addendum to that, because as you were speaking, you reminded me of something, and I feel like this might even kind of address one of the questions the question that Maya brought up. The value of storytellers here, I mean, can't be underestimated. We're just all a collection of stories, I suppose. But what is the story of the investment? And what are you trying to build? Is it really burnout, or is there another story that we could tell here? I don't know. I encourage us to I think so much about who do you partner with, who is your team. Doesn't mean governance structure, it just means the people around you. Make sure that you have storytellers around to help you understand where you're, how you're framing both the problem and the solution.
Yeah, and I think going back to Maya's question, building these open source communities and getting traction is ridiculously hard work, right? And it's in most cases, so it's everybody thinks that just sort of they build something and everybody loves it and everybody comes and contributes, and that just doesn't happen, right? It requires an incredible amount of work to build these communities and to recruit contributors, because recruiting contributors is actually it's not magic. It's a manual effort of talking to people and pulling people in. And that's exhausting, right? And that, in a lot of cases, results in things like burnout. And I think it's okay that not every project, makes it over the long term. One of the research projects I just kicked off within the CHAOSS community is looking at projects that have been archived, big projects that were archived, popular projects that were archived, and why, and looking at them and seeing, was it because the developer just couldn't do it anymore through burnout, job changes, all sorts of things? Did the technology evolve to the point where this is just not needed anymore? Were there corporate reasons for this? And so looking at the reasons for these things being archived, and just to help people better understand that it's not necessarily a failure of you or your project. It's just there are a lot of reasons that projects don't make it over the long term, and I think that's okay. We should stop beating ourselves up over it.
Thank you.
Can I get to Tim's question?
I like to be on time, and it is 15 after, so we need to move the remaining
win the
conversation
We've got 1 minute.
Yeah.
Okay, it says 4:15.
Just changed. Literally
So
just changed.
thank you. We can definitely come on up. We can continue conversation. We just want to end on time the official panel. So thank you so much for being here.